I bounced into the kitchen that morning, my heart practically skipping a beat. "Mom, I can't wait for Sarah's wedding tomorrow. Have you seen the dress I picked out?" I practically spilled my excitement across the counter. I'd imagined every detail for weeks. The colors, the flowers, even the way I would toast my sister without making it awkward. I wanted it to be perfect. Mom glanced up from her coffee, her expression unreadable. Then she said it. "Oh, honey, that was last week." For a moment, the words didn't sink in. I blinked, trying to process the sentence, my mind refusing to make sense of it. Last week? My stomach dropped, and heat crept up my neck. Embarrassment, confusion, and a strange sense of disbelief all collided at once. I sank into the chair, trying to make sense of it. "Wait, what?" I asked, my voice small. "You mean, it already happened?" Mom shrugged casually. "Yes, I thought you knew." I wanted to scream, cry, or maybe just disappear right there on the kitchen floor. Instead, I forced a shaky laugh. "Oh, okay." But inside, my chest tightened. How could I have been so oblivious? How had I missed it? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone told me? As I sipped my lukewarm coffee, memories flooded back unbidden. Times I'd shown up for birthdays that no one remembered. Times I had helped with school projects, only for them to praise Sarah for the exact same thing. The Christmas when I'd stayed up all night wrapping gifts, only for my presents to be, accidentally, left under the tree in the wrong spot. I remembered the time I'd practiced my piano recital for months. And while I played flawlessly, only a polite nod from Mom greeted me, while Sarah's mediocre performance the following week earned cheers, flowers, and social media posts. A lump formed in my throat. These weren't just coincidences, they were patterns. Moments like these had shaped me into someone who expected little from my family, someone who had learned to shrink into the background, silently enduring the favoritism that seemed to shadow every corner of our house. Yet, in that kitchen, sitting across from Mom, something stirred inside me. A spark, not anger, not yet, but awareness. I realized how often I had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that tight knot of frustration and humiliation morph into something else. Clarity. I didn't say anything more. I just nodded, mumbled, "Okay, thanks for letting me know," and walked out. But inside, a story was already unfolding. A story where I would no longer be invisible. Where I would find a way to make them see me, finally, in a way they could not ignore. That morning, the shock wasn't just that I had missed the wedding. The real shock was realizing how little my presence mattered, and how much I intended to change that. As I wandered back into my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Mom's casual dismissal about Sarah's wedding wasn't an isolated incident. It was just another chapter in a long history of favoritism. I began noticing it all over again, like old scars suddenly stinging. There were the small things, at first glance almost insignificant, but they accumulated over the years like pebbles in my shoes. The birthday gifts, for example. Sarah would unwrap the latest gadgets, jewelry, or trips Mom had meticulously planned, while my own birthdays passed with store-bought cards, generic gifts, or the occasional "I forgot." Sorry. I had learned to smile anyway, to thank them, to nod along as though it didn't hurt. And the achievements, they were never mine to celebrate. When I got the award for top grades in my senior year, Mom's congratulations were polite, almost perfunctory. But the week after, Sarah won the school talent show with a mediocre performance. And suddenly there were banners, a social media flood of photos, and family friends calling to congratulate the golden child. I tried to brush it off back then, telling myself it was okay, that recognition didn't matter. But deep down it festered. Even the casual comments left bruises. "You're too quiet. Maybe you should try being more like your sister," Mom would say, or, "Sarah is so outgoing and confident. You could take a page from her book." Those words were always meant as advice, but they stung like comparisons meant to diminish me. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I wasn't just overlooked. I was measured, judged, and found lacking beside my sister. I remembered the holidays most vividly. Sarah's accomplishments, relationships, and social events always took center stage. I tried to cheer her on, to be supportive, but there was a gnawing ache in the pit of my stomach every time Mom gushed over her with relatives or praised her endlessly at family gatherings. Meanwhile, my contributions, the quiet ones, the ones that took effort but went unseen, were barely acknowledged. I thought back to last Christmas. I had stayed up late for weeks, baking cookies and preparing gifts for the entire family. Sarah, meanwhile, had ordered gifts online at the last minute. Mom swooned over Sarah's thoughtfulness, while barely glancing at my meticulously prepared efforts. That moment had felt like a slap I hadn't realized I'd been absorbing for years. Even as I revisited these memories, I realized it wasn't just about gifts or praise. It was about attention, love, and recognition. I had been trained, unconsciously, to shrink, to fade, to make space for my sister, the favored one. My thoughts circled like vultures, picking at old wounds. Why did she always get the spotlight? Why did my efforts barely matter, and there was no denying it now? Mom's slip about Sarah's wedding was not a one-time oversight. It was the latest proof that I was invisible in my own family. It wasn't just favoritism. It was habitual neglect dressed up as casual parenting. And for the first time, I let myself feel anger, not just embarrassment, but real simmering resentment. Yet beneath the anger, a strange clarity formed. I saw patterns I hadn't seen before, understood the subtle dynamics that kept me underestimated, and realized that if I wanted change, it wouldn't come from waiting for Mom or anyone else to notice me. I would have to create it myself. A seed of determination took root that day, nourished by years of being overlooked. The resentment I'd carried silently for so long was no longer just a weight, it was fuel. I could feel it humming in my chest as I plotted, in whispers to myself, how I might one day turn these patterns upside down. Not in anger, not in rage, but with careful calculation, quiet power, and a revelation that would leave them finally seeing me. Really seeing me. That evening, I sat at my desk with my journal open, a blank page staring back at me like a mirror. I had always thought journaling was just a way to pass time, but tonight it felt different. It was the only place I could speak freely, the only place where my thoughts mattered without judgment or comparison. I picked up my pen and started writing. Why do I always feel invisible? The words hit the page with surprising force. I paused, letting the question linger. I thought about all the times I had been overshadowed, all the birthdays, achievements, and small victories that had gone unnoticed. The thought of Sarah, celebrated for almost everything she touched, gnawed at my chest. I wrote about the wedding confusion, how Mom had casually mentioned it had already happened, as though my excitement meant nothing. And suddenly all the memories came flooding back. The times I had worked late on projects, gone out of my way to help family members, stayed up nights planning surprises, and yet received little more than a passing nod or a shrug. Each memory was a stab of recognition that my presence had been treated as optional. The pen moved across the page almost on its own. I began detailing every moment that had made me feel small. The birthday my parents forgot entirely. The Christmas when only Sarah's performance was worthy of applause. The dinners where my thoughts were brushed aside while hers were dissected and praised. With each recollection, I felt a mix of sadness, anger, and, unexpectedly, a sense of validation. I was right to feel this way. I wasn't imagining it. I realized that acknowledging these slights didn't make me bitter. It made me aware. Awareness, I decided, was power. I could no longer let the pattern continue unnoticed. Writing it all down made me see the clear line connecting every slight and every overlooked effort, tracing a map of favoritism and neglect. But the journal wasn't just for listing grievances. I began to reflect on my own worth. I reminded myself of my accomplishments, my intelligence, my perseverance. I recalled the times I had solved problems no one noticed, the moments when my quiet actions had kept the family or even friends from disaster. I had been patient, empathetic, and enduring. Those qualities were mine and they mattered, even if no one had recognized them before. I started to craft a mental picture of the person I wanted to be. Someone no longer invisible. Someone who could assert their presence without anger or malice. Someone who could turn past neglect into personal strength. I imagined moments where my family would finally see me as capable, intelligent, and confident. Not overshadowed, not overlooked. The thought alone sent a thrill through me. In the quiet of my room, I allowed myself a small, private smile. For the first time in years, I felt hope. A controlled, simmering hope that didn't rely on anyone else's validation. My pen continued to move across the page, writing down not only what had happened, but what I intended to do. Not revenge and rage, but in cleverness. Not to humiliate, but to demonstrate my worth in a way they cannot ignore. By the time I closed the journal, I felt lighter. Reflection had done more than uncover pain. It had given me clarity. I knew what I had to do. The spark that had flickered in the kitchen that morning had now become a steady flame. I would no longer be sidelined, no longer invisible. Every overlooked achievement, every unacknowledged effort, every casual insult was fuel for the strategy forming in my mind. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I repeated the promise silently to myself. They will see me. And when they do, they won't know what hit them. But they'll never forget it. The following weekend, I went to help Mom organize some old files in the attic. A mundane task I usually avoided, but something inside me nudged me to go. As I sifted through dusty envelopes and faded letters, my hand froze on a thick manila folder labeled Family Estate and Investments. Curiosity overpowered caution. I flipped it open, expecting old receipts or forgotten bills. What I found instead made my heart race and my stomach drop. Pages of documents, detailed accounts, investments, and even personal loans that I had never been privy to. But it wasn't just numbers. It was a record of how much Mom had favored Sarah financially, sometimes in blatant, unmistakable ways. Trust funds, shares in a family business, and discretionary spending budgets were all skewed heavily toward my sister. My own accounts and benefits? Minimal. The math was undeniable. The favoritism I had felt emotionally all these years now had tangible, material consequences. I sat back, absorbing the shock. It wasn't just a pattern of neglect. It was systemic. Every overlooked birthday, ignored achievement, and subtle insult had been reinforced by a family structure that literally invested in one child over the other. I felt a mix of disbelief, anger, and, strangely, vindication. I hadn't imagined it. It was all real. As I paged through more documents, I discovered subtle manipulations too. There were promissory notes, loans forgiven for Sarah but not for me, even arrangements where she received special allowances from distant relatives while my contributions and needs were quietly sidelined. Each page seemed to mock me silently. You don't matter. She does. The revelation hit hardest when I found a recent letter from the family accountant. It described the allocation of inheritance funds. I read the sentence over and over. Given the demonstrated responsibility and leadership of Sarah, the majority of the estate is allocated to her. Responsibility and leadership? According to them, my accomplishments didn't even register. The injustice stung in a way that words alone couldn't capture. For a long time, I sat there, flipping the papers again and again. My mind replayed moments from the past, connecting the dots like a detective piecing together a crime. The forgotten birthdays, the overlooked achievements, the favoritism, the praise lavished on Sarah for mediocrity. It all had a foundation. I realized then that my resentment wasn't just about emotions. It was about real, measurable inequity. But with clarity came a new perspective. This wasn't just about anger. This was about awareness. I understood now that if I wanted recognition, not just emotional but tangible, I would have to navigate these family dynamics carefully. Reacting impulsively could backfire. The family system was stacked, yes, but knowledge was my weapon. The documents I held in my hands were proof, undeniable and factual. A plan began to form in my mind. Subtle, strategic, patient, I could no longer remain invisible, and now I had the ammunition to ensure they saw me. Not through petty arguments or shouting, but through clever moves, timing, and a display of competence that would force acknowledgement. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was quantifiable, and therefore conquerable. I imagined moments where I could assert myself, where my contributions, intelligence, and foresight would shine in ways impossible to ignore. It wasn't about hurting anyone, at least, not initially. but about claiming what was mine, about demonstrating value in a family that had never truly seen it. As I closed the folder and set it carefully on my desk, I felt a thrill I hadn't felt before, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was standing at the edge of a decision: continue quietly as before, invisible and undervalued, or step into a role where my voice and actions would finally command respect. The attic was quiet, dust motes floating in the sunlight. But inside, a storm had begun. Knowledge had changed everything. What had felt like vague favoritism was now concrete reality, and the path forward was clear. I wasn't powerless, not anymore. That evening, I met up with my friend Alex at our favorite coffee shop. The cozy hum of chatter and the rich smell of espresso were comforting, a small sanctuary from the storm of my family life. I slumped into the booth across from him, my journal clutched in one hand, my thoughts still spinning. I don't even know where to start, I admitted, voice low. It's like I've been invisible my whole life. And now I know it's deliberate. Mom, everyone, they've favored Sarah. Financially, socially, emotionally. Everything. Alex leaned back, studying me with that quiet, analytical look that always made me feel both seen and challenged. You've been noticing this for a while, haven't you? He asked. I nodded, rubbing at the back of my neck. Yeah, but seeing it in writing, in black and white, it's different. There's the inheritance, the accounts, all the allowances. And Mom acts like it's normal, like I shouldn't even care. I feel angry, humiliated, and honestly, small. Alex was silent for a moment, letting my words settle. Then he smiled gently. Small? He said, raising an eyebrow. You've handled more than most people twice your age. You've been patient, strategic, and unnoticed. That's not weakness. That's practice. Practice for when it's your time to step up. I blinked, taken aback. Practice. For what? For seeing the big picture, he said. Right now, you're in the position most people would kill to be in later. You know the truth, and they don't know you know. That's power. You just need to use it carefully. I let that sink in. He was right. All these years of being overlooked had given me a vantage point that Sarah, or even Mom, never had. I had information, perspective, and emotional clarity, and I could act. But how? That's the thing, I admitted. I don't want to be petty. I don't want to humiliate anyone. I just want them to see me, respect me, maybe even regret underestimating me. Alex nodded knowingly. Exactly. You don't need to be loud. Sometimes the quiet moves are the most devastating. Think chess, not checkers. Use your knowledge, your competence, and timing. You'll make your point without giving them a single chance to anticipate it. I smiled faintly, a spark of excitement threading through the frustration. So, small, subtle steps first? Yes, he said, leaning in. Plant seeds. Demonstrate your value. Let them think nothing is happening until it's undeniable. You want empowerment, not chaos. And always remember, your goal isn't revenge, it's recognition. Karma will take care of itself if you play it smart. I scribbled notes in my journal, outlining small actions, subtle ways to show responsibility, hints of capability, timing my visibility to coincide with moments that would matter most to the family. Each note made my chest swell with anticipation. Before leaving, Alex added, one more thing, document everything. Keep track of their favoritism, their slips, their words. Concrete evidence strengthens your position, and trust me, the day you act, you'll look back and thank yourself for every observation, every detail you've held onto. As I walked home that night, my mind buzzed with possibilities. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like a player in a game I finally understood. Every slight, every overlooked birthday, every unacknowledged effort, everything had a purpose now. And for the first time, I smiled not out of hope, but out of certainty. They're going to see me, and when they do, it will be unforgettable. A week later, I got a call from Mom, sounding flustered for once. Honey, something's come up with Sarah's wedding arrangements, she said, her voice tight with stress. I don't know how to fix it, and I'm worried everything will fall apart. Can you help? My heart raced. This was it. The opportunity I had been waiting for. The first chance to prove that I wasn't just the invisible child. Calmly, I agreed. keeping my tone measured. Of course, Mom. Tell me exactly what's happening. As she explained, it became clear that a key vendor had double-booked the venue, flowers hadn't arrived, and the photographer had gotten lost. Most people would have panicked, but I immediately began organizing a plan. I called the florist, rearranged delivery schedules, and personally located the photographer. I even drafted a quick seating adjustment for the reception to accommodate last-minute changes. Every move was efficient, subtle, and precise. By the time I arrived at the venue, everything was running smoothly. Staff were in place, decorations were corrected, and the atmosphere felt calm rather than chaotic. Mom was stunned. I don't know how you did all this so quickly, she murmured, almost sheepishly. I smiled faintly, shrugging. I just stayed organized and focused. It's easier than it looks when you know what needs attention. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I caught a flash of surprise, maybe even recognition. She realized, if only subconsciously, that I was capable, dependable, and able to handle situations she had assumed I would fumble. The subtle victory didn't end there. When Sarah arrived, stressed and slightly annoyed at the delays, I calmly walked her through the plan. She paused, glancing at me with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Wow, you did all this?" she asked, her tone carrying the faintest edge of surprise. "Yes," I said simply, keeping my voice gentle but confident. "Everything's ready. You just focus on enjoying your day." For the first time in years, I felt a thrill of quiet triumph. I didn't need applause and I didn't need to boast. The proof was in the results, and the results spoke louder than any words. Mom's gasp, Sarah's astonished glance, even the murmured praise from the event staff. It all affirmed what I had known in my heart. I was capable, I mattered, and in that moment, I had reversed the family's expectation of me, even if just slightly. Later, as we drove home, Mom was uncharacteristically quiet. I could sense her processing the revelation. Her golden child had relied on me, and I had delivered flawlessly. I imagined the thoughts running through her mind. Maybe I underestimated her. Maybe she's more competent than I thought. The feeling was intoxicating. I had orchestrated a small, smart victory without drama, shouting, or confrontation. The family hadn't noticed the effort it took to pull it off, which made the impact even sweeter. They were caught off guard, and I could see the subtle shift in perception taking root. That night, I wrote in my journal, documenting the success with quiet satisfaction. I didn't need to exaggerate or embellish. Every detail mattered. The delivery times, the staff's reactions, Mom's subtle hesitation, Sarah's stunned acknowledgement. They were all evidence that I had begun to assert myself. I realized something important. Small, strategic moves had the power to change perception more effectively than any confrontation or outburst. By demonstrating competence in a crisis, I had claimed a position of respect in a space where I had previously been invisible. As I closed the journal, I felt a surge of confidence. This was just the beginning. If I could execute one reversal like this quietly, carefully and successfully, then the next steps, the bigger reversals, the ultimate vindication, were well within reach. After the wedding crisis was resolved, something shifted in the family dynamic, though they didn't realize it yet. Mom and Sarah had a new awareness of me, a faint recognition that I wasn't as passive or invisible as they'd assumed. I could see it in the way they paused slightly longer before dismissing my suggestions, the way they subconsciously weighed my opinions a bit more carefully. I began noticing little provocations from them, almost playful but tinged with the old favoritism. "I'm not sure you'd know how to handle this, dear," Mom said one evening, gesturing toward a trivial household issue. "Maybe Sarah can help." Her words were casual, but the tone carried that familiar edge, the assumption that I was incapable, that my input didn't matter. Rather than react angrily, I let it slide. I smiled politely, nodding as if acknowledging her point, all the while storing the moment away. Each slight, each underestimation, was a piece of the puzzle I was constructing. My mind replayed the countless times I had been dismissed, the times I had been told I was too sensitive, too quiet, too insignificant. These moments, once painful, now fueled a slow-burning strategy. Sarah, too, began to exhibit small, subtle digs. "Be careful with that," she'd say, almost laughing, when I offered ideas about the family business. Or, "Don't get your hopes up. Some things are beyond you," she'd remark lightly during dinner, as if testing me, reminding me of old hierarchies. Each comment, each sly taunt, was like a spark thrown onto dry tinder. I could feel my blood pressure rise, but I maintained composure. I understood the value of measured restraint, of letting them provoke me without losing control. At night, alone in my room, I would replay these encounters. I let myself feel the sting of the past alongside the amusement of the present. Their assumptions, their underestimations, they were predictable, and I had already begun turning them into tools. Each casual insult, each taunting remark, became part of a larger narrative in my mind, the story of their eventual reckoning. I also used subtle provocations myself, not openly confrontational, but strategic reminders that I was competent and aware. I would finish tasks without being asked, resolve minor crises quietly, or make perfectly timed comments that hinted at knowledge or preparation. The family noticed, of course, but they couldn't quite place why it unsettled them. It was the beginning of a pattern. I was no longer invisible, but they didn't yet know the full extent of my capabilities. Even the family dinner table became a stage for tension. Sarah would casually reference a past success of hers, expecting me to shrink. Instead, I let her words linger in the air for a beat before calmly responding with a subtle, pointed observation. I remember that. And I learned a lot from it, especially what not to do next time. The remark was casual, polite, almost conversational, but it carried weight. They felt it. I could see it in their faces. With every interaction, I felt the suspense building, not just for myself, but for the audience living vicariously through my story. Each provocation, each sly dig, each understated display of competence was a thread in the growing tension. The question hung in the air. When would the full payoff come? When would they see the extent of what they had underestimated? By now, the emotional stakes had escalated. Mom's subtle unease, Sarah's forced smiles, and the undercurrent of surprise and tension made every encounter charged with anticipation. I was patient, letting the suspense simmer. I had learned that the best power reversals weren't loud. They were calculated, delayed, and unavoidable. And so, I waited, poised, letting the family continue underestimating me, unaware that each slight they delivered was only tightening the narrative of their eventual reckoning. The stage was set, the tension was real, and the audience, watching, feeling, imagining, could almost taste the satisfaction that was slowly approaching. After days of reflection and observing the family's reactions, I knew I needed more than small, clever gestures. The first reversal had shown them that I was capable, but it wasn't enough to shift the entire dynamic. I needed a plan, quiet, calculated, and impossible to ignore. I started by reviewing everything I knew about the family's behavior. Patterns of favoritism, financial decisions, social biases. Every casual insult, every overlooked effort, every whispered slight was cataloged in my mind and in my journal. I realized that their arrogance and assumptions weren't just predictable, they were exploitable. I made a list of key leverage points. Mom, for instance, had a tendency to underestimate me in social settings. She often flaunted Sarah's achievements without considering the subtle ways she minimized mine. Sarah, on the other hand, relied heavily on appearances and social approval. I could use that, and then there were the extended family members, easily swayed by prestige and proof of competence. All of them had blind spots, and I intended to find the perfect moment to highlight them. Next, I thought about timing. The best reversals, I realized, weren't immediate. They were well-timed, unavoidable, and undeniable. I needed a situation where my actions could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Ideally, it would involve a public or semi-public setting, small enough for them to notice, significant enough for it to matter. I also considered my tools. Knowledge was my strongest weapon. I had financial documents, records of favoritism, and detailed observations of their behavior. Patience was another. They assumed I would react emotionally, that I would lash out or pout, but I would act subtly. calmly, with precision. Even a small display of competence or insight would be magnified by the contrast of their underestimation. I began imagining scenarios in my head, testing each one like a chessboard. Could I resolve a situation that Sarah had left unresolved, proving my intelligence and reliability? Could I quietly expose a social hypocrisy that Mom or Sarah had assumed would go unnoticed? Could I create a scenario where my planning and foresight would be undeniable, leaving them scrambling to catch up? Then it hit me, the upcoming family gathering. It wasn't just a casual dinner. It was an event where achievements would be discussed, favors exchanged, and egos quietly inflated. If I timed my move right, I could leverage both social perception and factual proof. A carefully orchestrated success here could subtly flip the hierarchy. My value visible, theirs momentarily humbled, but without drama or confrontation. I wrote down contingencies, anticipating their reactions. They might try to interrupt or dismiss me. I had a response for that. They might laugh, try to mask surprise. I had a counter for that too. Every possible variable was accounted for. Most importantly, I reminded myself of my goal: recognition and respect, not petty humiliation. I didn't want revenge for its own sake. I wanted to correct the imbalance, to make them understand the consequences of their long-standing favoritism. Every move had to be clever, precise, and emotionally satisfying. By the time I closed my journal that night, the plan was taking shape. It was subtle, quiet, and smart, a demonstration of capability, intelligence, and foresight that could not be ignored. The first reversal had been a warm-up. This one would leave a lasting impression, one that would shift the family's perception of me irrevocably. As I lay in bed, excitement coursing through me, I felt a sense of calm anticipation. I wasn't reacting to their provocations anymore. I was orchestrating outcomes, quietly bending events to my advantage. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the next reversal, more impactful than anything they expected, was within reach. The night of the family gathering arrived, a semi-formal dinner with extended relatives and close friends. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the usual undercurrent of competition and comparison. Sarah floated through the room like a golden child, her every accomplishment quietly celebrated, while I moved through the crowd with careful composure, invisible to most, or so they thought. Mom gave me a polite nod, the kind reserved for someone who had just entered the room, nothing more. Sarah shot me a brief dismissive glance. They still don't see me, I thought. Perfect. The first hour was routine, small talk, casual updates, and the usual commentary on Sarah's achievements. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. A problem that no one noticed, but I had anticipated. The dessert catering had been mismanaged, the signature cake meant for the evening had been left in storage, and the servers were struggling to salvage the situation without ruining presentation or timing. Panic whispered among the staff, but none of the adults noticed immediately. I stepped forward calmly, keeping my voice measured and polite. "Excuse me, I think I can help," I said, scanning the scene. Mom and Sarah barely looked at me, assuming I wouldn't be of much use. That underestimation, that casual assumption of my incompetence, was the spark I needed. Within minutes, I had reorganized the serving schedule, arranged the desserts so they were visually appealing, and even suggested a minor adjustment to the cake display to accommodate the delay. I guided the staff efficiently, coordinating timing and flow while keeping everything unobtrusive. By the time the desserts were presented, everything ran seamlessly. The room erupted in quiet admiration, and eyes naturally turned toward me. Mom froze mid-sip of her wine. Her expression betrayed surprise, an acknowledgement she tried to mask with a polite smile. Sarah's eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "Wow, I didn't realize this would happen so smoothly," she murmured, almost under her breath. I kept my composure, responding softly. "It's nothing. Just noticed the timing and made some adjustments." My tone was calm, almost casual, but the impact was undeniable. In their eyes, I had done something none of them expected. The subtle victory rippled through the room. Cousins, aunts, and even distant family members murmured appreciation. For the first time in years, my presence mattered in a way that wasn't fleeting or polite. It was earned through capability. I felt a quiet thrill as I watched their faces, the recognition slowly dawning. Sarah tried to reclaim the spotlight, making a few light jokes about her own prior efforts with desserts, but the contrast had already been established. Mom, too, shifted slightly in her chair, a silent acknowledgement that she had underestimated me once again. This wasn't humiliation, not yet, but it was a momentary reversal of expectations. They had assumed I was passive, weak, or incapable, and I had disproven it, gracefully and definitively. As the evening continued, I felt a quiet satisfaction coursing through me. The tension that had been simmering for weeks reached its peak. They had seen a glimpse of the person I could be when underestimated, and the look of surprise, admiration, and perhaps subtle unease was priceless. For me, this was more than a practical win. It was a psychological victory. By the time the dinner concluded, the family's perception had subtly shifted. I was no longer just the overlooked sibling. I was someone capable of navigating chaos with poise. Someone who could assert competence without drama. Someone they might underestimate at their own peril. Walking home that night, I felt the exhilaration of anticipation. This was only the second reversal. The first had been a small, clever victory, and this one had raised the stakes. The next moves would be even more strategic, more visible, and the ultimate reckoning was now within sight. The night of the celebration felt bigger than any other family event. Long table, fairy lights, cousins I barely knew, the polite clink of wine glasses. Mom had insisted on hosting at our old dining room, insisting it would be intimate. I'd smiled and said yes, all the while knowing that this was exactly the stage I wanted. The lights made everyone softer, more photogenic. It was perfect for the reveal. I arrived early, helped fluff the napkins, greeted the caterer, and slipped into my role as the quietly competent one. Mom floated around in a new dress, glowing, already half in performance mode. Sarah drifted through the room, laughing at jokes, collecting compliments like confetti. The conversation orbited her, as it always had. That small, familiar knot tightened in my chest. But this time it was electric with purpose, not helplessness. As plates were cleared, laughter settling into a low hum, I asked politely if the family accountant, Mr. Bennett, could give a brief update on a couple of logistical things, a plausible request. Everyone trusted him, and his presence wouldn't raise eyebrows. I'd texted him earlier. "Can you come by briefly during dinner? I have something I want you to glance over." His nod when he arrived was calm, oblivious to the weight of the papers I'd left on the sideboard. When he stood, cousins quieted. People have a strange respect for men who talk numbers. Mom smiled, delighted. "Oh, Benny, do tell us about the property thing," she prompted, basking in her role as matriarch. I watched her, watched Sarah. Let my palms stay steady. Mr. Bennett began with the usual dry updates, rental incomes, maintenance schedules. I let that flow, the family nodding politely. Then I stood up, cleared my throat softly and said, "Actually," before Benny finishes, "I thought it might be good for everyone to see the most recent allocations. Because I've been trying to understand the family finances better, and I realize there are a few things that might need clarification for all of us." There was a ripple of interest. Mom's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly. Sarah's brow creased. I felt my heart drum against my ribs, but my voice was calm. "Benny, would you mind reading the summary page in that folder, page 3? The one titled Proposed Inheritance Allocation 2025? He blinked, flipped to the page. His professional tone wavered a hair as he read aloud. Given the demonstrated responsibility and leadership of Sarah, he stuttered, and my stomach tightened. I hadn't wanted him to read it verbatim, yet hearing it out loud felt like watching a wound open, and then being handed a mirror. The room shifted. Someone coughed. I watched faces go pale, then guilty. The smug, pleasant air dissolved into something brittle. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I folded the corners of the page, set the folder on the table, and looked directly at Mom. "Do you remember signing these documents, Mom? Do you remember saying out loud that Sarah demonstrated responsibility and leadership enough to receive the majority of the estate?" My tone was measured, every syllable intentional. Mom's hands trembled as she reached for her glass. I thought, she began, then stopped. I let her flounder. There was no need to pounce. The silence was doing the work. Sarah laughed nervously, a tiny sound. It's just how things were arranged. There's nothing to make a fuss about. Her smile felt brittle, a mask. I leaned forward, quieter now, the weight of the room leaning with me. The thing is, I said, this isn't just language. It's money. It's access. It's allowances forgiven for her and loans denied for me. It explains why certain relatives are close to her and distant with me. It explains why I've been treated as optional. My voice softened, but every eye stuck to me now, because I had their attention finally. I pushed a second folder across the table. Copies, neatly labeled, of the allocation, the forgiven promissory notes, the letters from relatives. I found these in the attic. I didn't publicize them. I didn't need to. But I thought, tonight, with everyone here, it's time we talked about how we treat each other. My fingers didn't shake. The paper was cool under my palm. Cousins exchanged glances. Aunt Lila's jaw tightened. Mr. Bennett, who'd read the page, looked like someone who'd accidentally tripped over a truth and couldn't pretend it was someone else's problem. Mom's color drained. Why would you go through that? She asked, voice suddenly small. Because I deserve to know, I said simply. Because for years I thought I was the one misreading things, until I found the proof that I wasn't. And because I'm tired of being invisible. Sarah's face crumpled. Part shock, part fury. You had no right! This is private! She shouted, the first loud note of the night. The accusation had venom, but it didn't land the way she intended. The room didn't recoil from me. It stilled, considering instead whether the documents had been accurate. If anything, Sarah's outrage made her look defensive. I slid a final sheet across to Mom. A simple list of everything I'd done that year. Projects I'd spearheaded. Crises I'd resolved. The time I'd sorted the wedding disaster. The dinner that hadn't collapsed because of my foresight. It wasn't an accusation so much as evidence. I wasn't shouting. I was presenting a ledger of my life. Do you see why this hurts? I asked her. Not because I want money, because choices like these tell a story about who matters in this family, and stories shape how we treat each other. My voice softened. I wanted recognition, not a feud. That mattered. Aunt Lila cleared her throat, a small sound of solidarity. This is not what I expected, she murmured. But it's important to hear. Others murmured agreement. The room no longer hummed in Sarah's orbit. Mom sank into her chair, face flushed. For the first time, I saw real regret, not performative apology. I didn't realize, she began, voice cracked. The sentence had no defense. The evidence sat between us, immovable. I could have launched into denunciation, list every slight, every forgotten birthday, but I didn't. Instead, I breathed and said what mattered most. I wanted you to understand why I stopped speaking up. I wanted you to see what you were doing, so we could decide if that's the family we want to be. There was no dramatic thunderclap, no fainting, no slamming doors. The reckoning was quieter, which made it more devastating. Faces that had always smiled politely at me now registered shame, confusion, and a dawning comprehension of consequences. Sarah's anger folded into something thinner, embarrassment, then a wounded pride. Mom's hand trembled on the tablecloth. Mr. Bennett shifted his weight, as if he'd just woken up to the part he'd played. Conversations restarted at low volume, tentative, reparative. Eyes met mine with something different. Not the polite, dismissive gaze of before, but a look that asked silently, what happens next? I didn't want their apologies to be the climax. My goal had never been to humiliate, only to be recognized. So I ended it with the two things I'd always wanted: clarity and control. I'm not asking for everything to be rearranged tonight, I said. But I'm asking for honest conversations, for fairness, for recognition of what I contribute. I folded my hands, steady. That's all. There was no triumphant music, no final fist pump, just a hush heavy with consequence. The emotional payoff wasn't a public spectacle. It was the undeniable shift that happens when a family realizes their story about you was incomplete and unfair. In their eyes, for the first time, I was a person with weight, not a footnote. As the night dissolved into quiet conversations and awkward hugs, I sat back and exhaled. The reveal had landed exactly where I wanted. Not mean, not vengeful, but final enough. They had been forced to look, and looking is the first step to change. The evening wound down, but the energy in the room hadn't entirely settled. Conversations had resumed, but there was a careful tension in the air. Eyes that had once skimmed past me now lingered uncertain. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not through casual acknowledgement, not through polite smiles, but through a recognition that I existed as an equal in the family's story. Mom was quiet, sitting in her favorite chair, hands folded in her lap. Her gaze occasionally flicked toward me, softening, unsure. I could sense the realization slowly dawning. Her long-held assumptions, the favoritism she had justified, the oversight of my accomplishments. It was all laid bare. She had misjudged me, underestimated my capabilities, and perhaps for the first time, she understood the depth of her mistakes. Sarah was more volatile in her reaction. Her initial anger and defensiveness had given way to a fragile mixture of embarrassment and awe. I caught her watching me across the table, her expression flickering between disbelief and reluctant respect. She realized she had relied on assumptions about my passivity and incapacity, assumptions that had now been shattered. The power dynamic had subtly, irrevocably shifted. I sat quietly, observing, allowing the room to process the truth at its own pace. The satisfaction wasn't about humiliation or revenge, it was about recognition. Years of invisibility, of being dismissed and overlooked, had culminated in this moment. The knowledge that I had achieved this without malice, without overt confrontation, only deepened the sense of triumph. My empowerment was internal. It radiated quietly, subtly, but it was unmistakable. As I reflected, flashes of the past came to mind, the overlooked birthdays, the casual dismissals, the whispered comparisons to Sarah. Those memories, once painful, now served as markers of my journey. Each slight had taught me patience, observation, and strategy. Each dismissal had sharpened my understanding of family dynamics and my own resilience. The emotional scars had become tools, shaping the person I had become. Competent, poised, and quietly formidable. I allowed myself a private smile, a moment of acknowledgement for my own growth. The validation I had long sought from my family was secondary now. The real victory was the certainty in my own abilities. I could see the shift in their perception, yes, but more importantly, I felt the shift within myself. I was no longer someone who waited to be noticed or acknowledged. I was a participant, a force, a voice that could no longer be ignored. Even as the room gradually returned to lighter chatter, I lingered in that moment of reflection. I thought about what it meant to claim one's space in a family that had long denied it. I understood that recognition wasn't given. It was earned, demonstrated, and sometimes quietly demanded. I had done all three tonight. The sense of empowerment was accompanied by clarity. I no longer needed to react to every slight or provocation. I could choose my moments, act with purpose, and assert myself with subtlety and strategy. The emotional payoff was complete. Vindication, internal strength, and a quiet, undeniable presence that could not be dismissed. As I left the gathering later that evening, the air crisp around me, I carried with me a calm, steady pride. The family had finally glimpsed the person I had always been. But more importantly, I had glimpsed myself, fully capable, fully empowered, and finally fully acknowledged in my own eyes. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the house felt different, lighter, yet charged with a new awareness. The events of the evening lingered in my mind, not as a source of anxiety, but as a testament to how far I had come. For years I had allowed the family's favoritism, subtle slights, and dismissals to define my sense of worth. Tonight, that had changed. I reflected on the journey that led me here. The overlooked birthdays, the whispered comparisons to Sarah, the countless times my efforts were ignored. Each moment that once wounded me now appeared as a stepping stone, shaping resilience, observation, and strategic thinking. Every slight had been a lesson in patience, every dismissal a lesson in subtlety. They had, unintentionally, prepared me to seize this moment with precision. For the first time, I felt truly empowered, not because of recognition from others, but because of the confidence I had cultivated within myself. I realized that self-worth is not granted by external validation. It is earned through persistence, clarity, and the courage to act when the moment calls for it. That awareness alone was transformative. I thought about the lessons I had learned through this ordeal. 1. Patience and preparation are more powerful than impulsive reactions. 2. Quiet competence often speaks louder than grand gestures. 3. Fairness and acknowledgement can be claimed without malice, through clarity and calculated action. Each lesson was embedded in the emotional journey I had experienced, and each carried a sense of lasting strength. Most importantly, I understood that I no longer needed to wait for the family's approval to feel whole. Their recognition was a welcome bonus, but my sense of self had been redefined. I had confronted the patterns that had kept me invisible, leveraged knowledge and composure to assert my presence, and emerged with my dignity intact. That internal victory mattered more than any external validation could. As I looked forward, I felt a calm confidence. Future interactions with Mom, Sarah, and the extended family would be different. Not because I intended to wage war, but because the balance had shifted. I was no longer the passive, overlooked sibling. I was a participant, an equal, and someone who would no longer allow themselves to be underestimated. The ordeal had strengthened me in unexpected ways. It had revealed the power of strategic patience, the importance of emotional intelligence, and the value of understanding one's own worth. It had also shown me the subtle art of quiet, effective influence, how to assert presence without aggression, how to command respect without confrontation. Closing my journal that night, I felt a deep sense of completeness. The story of my invisibility, neglect, and underestimation had reached its conclusion, not with bitterness, but with clarity and empowerment. I had turned past pain into a roadmap for growth, proving to myself that recognition begins within. For the first time, I smiled fully, not because the family had acknowledged me entirely, but because I had acknowledged myself. That awareness, that confidence, was a victory far greater than any inheritance or accolade. I had reclaimed my story, redefined my worth, and, most importantly, had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably certain of my own value. The weeks following the confrontation brought an uneasy calm. Life returned to its rhythms, family dinners, casual visits, and social gatherings. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The smiles were still there, the polite exchanges still perfunctory, yet I could feel the subtle tension lingering like an undercurrent. Mom's gaze occasionally carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Sarah's words were tinged with caution, and even distant relatives seemed to notice a quiet authority in me that hadn't existed before. It was a reminder that victory, even a justified one, rarely erases old habits entirely. Relationships that had been forged over favoritism and oversight don't instantly reset. Trust takes time to rebuild, and old patterns are stubborn. I understood this better than anyone. I had achieved recognition, demonstrated my worth, and reclaimed a measure of agency. But the family dynamic, while shifted, would never be exactly the same. Yet, in that awareness, I found peace. I had taken control of my story, and for the first time, I no longer felt dependent on the approval of those who had long underestimated me. I had confronted neglect with strategy, favoritism with competence, and invisibility with deliberate presence. Every subtle reversal, every quiet assertion, had culminated in a moment of undeniable validation. I had proven to them, and more importantly, to myself, that my voice mattered, my efforts had weight, and my contributions could not be ignored. Still, as I reflected, I realized that empowerment is often bittersweet. Some bridges had been mended, others remained charred, scarred by years of neglect and misjudgment. The satisfaction of vindication was tempered by the knowledge that certain relationships may never return to innocence. And perhaps that was the truest lesson. Personal strength is not measured by the forgiveness of others, but by the clarity and confidence you cultivate within yourself. I thought back to the pivotal moments, the overlooked achievements, the casual taunts, the subtle favoritism. Each one had been a seed for growth, a lesson in resilience, and a test of patience. Every minor victory, the wedding crisis resolved, the second reversal at the gathering, the documents quietly presented, had been a rehearsal for this understanding. In confronting the family, I had discovered not only my capabilities, but also the limits of what external recognition could provide. True empowerment comes from within. And yet, I could not ignore the lingering sting of unresolved tensions. Mom's hesitations, Sarah's guarded glances, the whispers from relatives. They reminded me that fairness in family is rarely absolute, that love and loyalty often compete with pride and habit. But rather than breeding bitterness, these tensions reinforced the importance of boundaries, discernment, and self-respect. I could navigate family dynamics with empathy, patience, and wisdom, without sacrificing my sense of self. As I closed this chapter of reflection, one thought crystallized in my mind, a quiet, lasting truth that lingered long after the eventful nights and the confrontations. Empowerment is not found in changing others, but in claiming your own worth, navigating life with clarity, and standing tall even when those around you fail to acknowledge your value. I looked toward the future with quiet confidence. I would continue to engage with my family, celebrate meaningful moments, and assert myself when necessary, but I would do so from a place of strength, not reaction. Vindication had been satisfying, but understanding my own power was transformative, and in that knowledge, I felt an unshakable peace. The assurance that fairness may be fleeting, favoritism may persist, but self-worth, once claimed, is forever. The night ended with a soft smile on my face and a final thought echoing in my mind. We cannot always change how others treat us, but we can always decide how we honor ourselves. Later that evening, after the family had dispersed and the house settled into calm, I sank into my favorite armchair with a cup of tea. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of settling wood. Alone, I allowed myself to reflect, not with gloating, not with bitterness, but with the deep, satisfying awareness of having claimed my own space. Memories from the past weeks replayed like a slow, deliberate film, the wedding crisis I had resolved, the subtle provocations I had endured, the clever maneuver at the family gathering, and the quiet exposure of favoritism through the documents. Each moment had been an opportunity, one I had met with patience, strategy, and calm precision. Now the results were clear. I had shifted perceptions, asserted my presence, and most importantly, reclaimed my dignity. I smiled softly, thinking of Mom's startled glance, Sarah's faltering composure, the way extended family members had suddenly acknowledged my competence. It had not been loud or dramatic, but the impact had been undeniable. For the first time, I felt the quiet power that comes not from confrontation, but from thoughtful action. I had demonstrated worth without aggression, intelligence without arrogance, and resilience without resentment. Sipping my tea, I let myself feel the subtle triumph ripple through me. It was not about proving superiority or forcing acknowledgement. It was about alignment between who I truly was and how I allowed the world to perceive me. That internal harmony was more satisfying than any applause, any nod, any forced apology. I had acted in accordance with my values and intentions, and that, in itself, was victory. I recalled the flashes of past injustice, dismissals, overlooked achievements, whispered comparisons to my sister, and realized they no longer held power over me. Each slight had been a lesson, each moment of invisibility a training ground for the patient strategy that had brought me here. The weight of resentment had lifted, replaced by calm assurance. I could finally engage with the family from a place of strength, not neediness, from observation, not defensiveness, from awareness, not insecurity. A quiet thought emerged. I am not defined by how others treat me, but by how I respond, and by what I choose to cultivate within myself. That knowledge resonated deeper than any external validation could. I had earned recognition in the eyes of the family, yes, but more importantly, I had earned it in my own heart. The moral satisfaction was complete. Justice tempered by patience, vindication delivered without malice, and empowerment achieved without drama. Leaning back, I allowed a small smile, one that spoke of contentment rather than triumphalism, to settle on my face. The world outside the house might still operate on bias, favoritism, and assumptions, but inside me, a quiet revolution had occurred. I had claimed my story, defined my value, and discovered the serene satisfaction of subtle power. Before setting my tea down, I whispered to the empty room, almost to myself, I mattered all along. I always did. And in that simple acknowledgement, I felt complete, a final emotional beat that offered both catharsis and moral resolution. The victory was quiet. It was understated, but it was absolute.